Okay, we're up to 18 people attending. Welcome everybody to today's presentation on Canadians in the Spanish Civil War with a focus on the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion. If you don't know me, if you're not from RUSI-VI, my name is Scott Osborne and I'm the president of the Royal United Services Institute of Vancouver Island, RUSI-VI, who is your host today. And today we welcome and we're very privileged to have Dr. James Kempling, who will give us a presentation entitled, as in the slide here, the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion, Canada and the Spanish Civil War. Now, if you're a member of RUSI-VI, I know you've seen Jim's bio details as I've sent them around to all of you. But just as a reminder, Jim has taught at the University of Victoria, with his focus being, and his research area of interest being Canada in the Great War, 1914-1918. Jim was also the project manager establishing the UVic digital history site called, and this is the digital address with no spaces, citygoestowar.ca, which covers Victoria's participation in the Great War. If you're interested in Victoria's story in the Great War, it's an excellent website with excellent archive and research material on that subject. Jim was also involved in establishing a digital website on the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion. I won't give you the digital email or the digital address, it's too long. But if you go in and Google Mackenzie-Papineau and attach UVic to that, I'm sure you'll find it and give you some more information. So today's presentation covers the little known story of the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion, or the Mac-Paps as they were nicknamed, a largely all-Canadian unit in the 15th International Brigade during the Spanish Civil War of the late 1930s. And also, I'm sure Jim will touch on the other Canadian volunteers who served in support of the Spanish Republican cause. Now, these international volunteers came from more than 60 countries, including Canada, probably to the total of about 42,000 international volunteers who participated in this, the first fight against international fascism. Jim will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. Then I will pose about half a dozen questions, followed by questions from you, the audience. Please write your questions on the Zoom chat or Q&A features and make them brief. We end no later than 2:30 p.m. And as usual, we're recording this webinar and we will post it to the RUSI-VI website as soon as possible. So if you want to watch it again, you can, or if you recommend it to friends and associates, they can see it on our RUSI-VI website. So thank you, Dr. Kempling, Jim, for taking the time to talk to us today. And if you're ready, please begin.
Thanks very much, Scott. I appreciate that. A bit of a confession to start off with. Scott mentioned that my area of interest is World War I. So in many ways, what I'm talking about today is what my students taught me rather than what I taught my students. I had a group together. Their job was to build a history website. I let them pick the subject. And strangely enough, they picked the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion and Canada in the Spanish Civil War. So I learned a great deal during that exercise. And this is a lot of that material. A couple of other notes on my background. I did spend 28 years in the Army and retired as a colonel in the PPCLI. So in outline, this is what I want to do. I want to start off by talking a little bit about Canada in the 1930s, what would have motivated these guys to pick up and head off to a country that few knew anything about. A little bit about communism in the 1930s, because the internal conflicts helped shape this great event. And then start off by looking at the opening round of the Civil War, German and Italian support for Franco, Soviet support for the Republicans, the International Brigades, the defense of Madrid, the bombing of Guernica. And all this takes place before the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion really gets into action. And I'll then talk about the action of the Mac-Paps, and then come back to say, what's happening today? How are we looking back on this? And how has that begun to change over time? If we look at the labor movement in Canada, we really need to go back to its roots in the pre-World War I period. Troops from Victoria went north to break up miners' strikes on the Mid-Island. People like Ginger Goodwin were active in the labor movement, and he's now reached practically sainthood in the labor movement in British Columbia. In the immediate aftermath of the war in 1919, May and June, the Winnipeg general strike helped shape the labor movement. About 30,000 people on the streets of Winnipeg. The government of this period is really quite paranoid about communism, and in late 1918, early 1919, the Siberian expedition ships out of Victoria to go and do battle with the Reds in Siberia. On the milder side, we have folks like J.S. Woodsworth and Tommy Douglas coming to prominence during this period. Woodsworth is elected in 1921, spends 20 years as a member of Parliament. Douglas, originally elected in 1935, later, of course, becomes the Premier of Saskatchewan. And these folks really help shape the nature of Canada today. Unemployment insurance, Medicare, and the like, we today attribute to Woodsworth and Douglas. So the movement is quite strong during this period, and we start to see left-wing members being elected to provincial and federal governments. But we're also in the mid of a depression. So by 1932, we have 75,000 people in BC registered as unemployed. And as is typical even today, you have a lot of transients coming in. Of course, the provincial government blames the federal government blames the provincial government, everybody blames the city, but the problem doesn't go away. The feds finally come on board with national defense work camps. I think, well, what we'll do is take all these people that are lazing around the street, we'll put them in work camps, we'll feed them, we'll house them, and we'll pay them the princely sum of 20 cents a day as an allowance, and perhaps that will solve the problem. And these are very much work camps. We're building highways and repairing railroads and things like that with basic hand tools, because the object is to create work, not necessarily to get the project done. So if you're a young male in Canada in this period, things are, to say the least, looking pretty grim. And the alternative of going off to what is becoming a rather romantic image of fighting fascists in Spain starts to look pretty appealing. The other event that occurs during this period is the On to Ottawa Trek. And this is the left really getting itself organized. And in the background, Canadian communists being very, very effective organizers. And basically, a whole bunch of folks jump on the train, as you can see in the image on the left, and head west. You see a very large parade in Calgary, a pretty peaceful thing. Government is starting to panic a bit. By the time they get to Regina, there's a major confrontation, quite bloody, a bit of overreaction by the government. The army brought in, the police brought in, and finally the On to Ottawa Trek is broken up. So you've got this very disaffected group of unemployed people, very, very strongly influenced by left-leaning politicians and in particular the communists. This is Tim Buck, a longtime leader of the Communist Party. Communism becomes illegal in Canada during this period, and Buck is charged with sedition and imprisoned for a couple of years. but undaunted, almost as soon as he gets out of prison, he runs for parliament, wins 25% of the vote. And that's quite a substantial increase from anything that has been seen before. But he still places third in the election, and the CCF wins. So a very strong left vote, but not enough to get Tim Buck into office. He tries again in Toronto in 1937, and again comes close, but never quite makes it. Now, Tim Buck is seen as a good, reliable, solid communist by the Stalinist communist group in the Soviet Union. He's seen as a good, reliable guy. But in fact, the party in Canada encompasses quite a large spread. So Trotskyites and the like, and people that are not particularly happy with Stalin are still welcomed into the Communist Party in Canada. But in terms of endorsing people to go to Spain, Tim Buck and the Communist Party are seen as a reliable source. A little bit about conflict amongst the communists. In the early days, you've got these three, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, basically sharing power. But after the death of Lenin in 1924, the struggle starts to get pretty bloody. Stalin is concerned about creating unity amongst communists, building communism in Russia first, whereas Trotsky is very much more about spreading communism worldwide. The two both have pretty bloody, sort of aggressive backgrounds, so nobody here is purer than the driven snow by any stretch of the imagination. But clearly, Stalin comes out on top. Trotsky is exiled from Russia, but this just means he is as much or more influential outside of Russia. So in places like Britain or Canada, you very often get two sides of a communist party. The hardcore supporting Stalin, getting funding and support from Russia, and the other group feeling much more noble, and we're the folks that are truer to our roots. However, that's rather debatable. Trotsky ends up moving around to a variety of countries, ends up in Mexico, where he's finally assassinated by the Russians in 1940. So we've got two disparate groups engaged in the battle. You can see on the left a poster from the nationalists, and by the nationalists I mean the fascists and Franco. They see themselves as getting rid of Bolshevism, social injustice, separatism, and so on and so on. I'm going to clean up Spain. And on the right, the Republican, the socialist group, a very disparate group, stretching from sort of anarchists to Tommy Douglas type socialists, and everything in between. And there is a good deal of infighting going on, particularly against the communist group that is controlled by, supported by Moscow, and the rest of them that are labeled Trotskyites, and they can get quite bloody with each other. But theirs is seen as a noble cause, fighting the terrible specter of fascism. A little bit about the background. We have back just after the turn of the century, Alfonso XIII, who was crowned at the age of 16. And you can imagine becoming king at 16 is likely to lead a person astray. And it certainly happens with Alfonso XIII. He begins to mess in things that are really not his business. We see Franco coming to prominence with a rebellion that takes place in Morocco, and Franco plays a prominent part in putting down the RIF, what is called the RIF War, and he rises quite rapidly in rank and prominence. September 1923, there's a coup d'état to install Primo de Rivera as dictator. This still keeps Alfonso there for the time being, but the end result is this coup d'état ends up mired in the worldwide economic depression. And ultimately, we see the resignation of de Rivera. 1931, the socialists win municipal elections, and by this time, Alfonso sees the end of the line and flees the country. Things are getting nasty with the socialists. There's a very strong anti-clerical movement, and we see some fairly nasty abuses of the Catholic Church. The socialists, for example, want to eliminate the church's role in education, and not surprisingly, the church takes exception to this. The end result in this left-right up and down game, the fascist Phalange Espanola is established in 1933. But by 1936, the leftist Popular Front wins a majority in the Cortes. And the leftist Popular Front, as I mentioned earlier, is a very, very diverse group of people. Leftist solidarity is not something that they've been able to achieve. On the right, Spain is seen as falling behind the rest of Western Europe. Discontent leading to the abdication of the king in 1931, not very popular. The abuses of the Second Republic, the radical reform, discontent amongst landowners and the church. And you see the election in 1933 of a right-wing coalition. But again, the response to that on the left is a whole series of strikes, primarily in the mining area. So you get this back and forth between left and right in the lead up to the war. The 1936 election of a left-wing coalition really pushes Franco over the edge. He's been shunted off to the Canary Islands, and a number of senior military people are purged during this period to try and reestablish the army as supportive of government. A little bit about the support that the various groups give. The Soviet support to the Republican movement is very substantial, and I've got a list here on the slide of the type of stuff they provide. The interesting thing is it doesn't come free of charge. Most of or a very substantial slice of Spain's gold reserve goes to Russia. And in part, it's to pay for the support that the Russians provide, but it's also to ensure for the left that the gold reserves of Spain that are quite substantial don't have any risk of falling into the hands of fascists should the left lose. The amount of gold that goes, if you take it in today's value, would amount to about $30 billion. Now, of course, the price of gold at this time is like $26 an ounce, and we all know what gold is worth today. The support by Soviet pilots is quite important. About 1,000 of them served with the Republican Air Force during this period, and the story is that a Russian pilot would disappear to go on leave, and he would come back some months later with a very good suntan and a big smile about the role they had played in Spain. And this is a group of Soviet pilots at an airfield near Madrid. German support for Franco is even more massive. About 600 aircraft provided directly, a couple of hundred tanks, importantly, 16,000 troops. And these are not a bunch of unemployed Canadians with little or no military experience or only a sprinkling of military experience. These are trained German soldiers coming to Spain. And even more importantly than the troops is the Condor Legion. These are not part of the Spanish Air Force. This is part of the Luftwaffe, but provide a huge amount of support to Franco. The German intent here is not simply to support a fascist overthrow of the government in Spain, but also to test out military tactics, the tactics that are developed in Spain, both for tanks and even more importantly for the Air Force, excuse me, really shape the way, particularly the early parts of the Second World War unfold. Italian support is even larger, and we've got a nice poster here of the great claw of fascist Italy descending on Spain. Here's 75,000 troops, and again, trained soldiers, a bunch of aircraft and tanks, motor vehicles, arms, and ammunition. The Italians pay quite heavily for their support of the Spanish Civil War, losing over 4,000 killed and 25% of all the equipment they provide. The important difference between the support by Italy and Germany for Franco is that Franco doesn't pay for this. There's no transfer of gold or any large sums of money. The rest of Europe has wants to try and keep this conflict confined to Spain. And so there is a general embargo on providing military support to Spain. So these three countries just flat out ignore it, but others find ways of getting around. France has a bit of a porous border, and France takes gold from Spain, exchanges it for hard currency, which can again be used for buying stuff that finds its way into Spain by one way or another. The beginning of the Spanish Civil War starts with army mutiny in Morocco. And this basically opens up the route for Franco to return from the Canary Islands to Morocco, and he rejoins the brigade that he commanded, or the division that he commanded. About the same time, we see the first of the International Brigades arriving in Spain to an area that is sort of central to the area that they have the greatest control. And we have, by the late 1936, the nationalist forces, and by this I mean Franco and the fascists, arrive in front of Madrid. Franco's thought at this time is that if I come in quickly, I move quickly on Madrid, the army garrison in Madrid will rise up and support me. That doesn't happen. The government has had enough time to purge the garrison in Madrid of many of its strongest pro-fascist supporters, senior officers and the like was done with Franco. They are either thrown out of the army or they are exiled and placed far away from Madrid. The other thing that happens in this period, in the spring of 1937, is the bombing of Guernica. And this has a huge impact on international attitudes towards the fascists. So this is a look at Spain in 1936, the pink area being the area that is dominated by Franco and the fascists, the nationalists, the blue area being Republican territory held by the left. And you can see Franco's move up around Madrid, and ultimately he's trying to cut the Republican-held territory in two. The defense of Madrid becomes one of those things that shapes public opinion, and you see the image of the young woman on the left that looks, I think, surprisingly like the statue we end up with here in Victoria, and the "Non pasarán," "you shall not pass," motto of the heroic defenders of Madrid is the way the image is created to the external world. And that is reinforced to somewhat by authors like George Orwell, who is in Spain at the time. And Orwell is one of these people that falls in the middle when it comes to being a communist. He starts off by appealing to the Communist Party of Great Britain, and they reject him. They say, yeah, you're not quite communist enough for us, George. And so he he turns to the anti-Stalinist pro-Trotsky United Marxist Workers Party to get himself to Spain. And there's a lot of these folks in and around Madrid. And Orwell writes a very powerful book about his experience, Homage to Catalonia, which is a worthwhile read, but it talks about the conflict within the left wing in Spain. The bombing of Guernica. Guernica is a little village. City is a bit of a stretch. If you think of Sydney about 10 years ago, that's the kind of place we're talking about. It's a market day when the bombing takes place. So there are several other thousand people in town. The Condor Legion comes in with bombers accompanied by fighter aircraft that strafe the area. It's indiscriminate. It's bombing of civilians, and you can see the city is reduced to ruin. Well, we've become used to these kind of pictures after World War II. But at the time, this is shocking to the outside world. This is beyond the bounds of, quote, civilized warfare. It's a war crime to bomb civilian areas. So the fascists win a military victory. The Condor Legion wins a military victory in that they are successful, but the loss in public relations, in propaganda, is massive, and the fascists are condemned everywhere in the rest of the world. Picasso is in Spain at the time, and the left has commissioned him to do some painting about the Boer, but he is so taken up with the bombing of Guernica that he produces his masterpiece. And this is a huge painting, meters and meters long and wide, covers the whole wall of a large room, and it's unveiled in Paris shortly after it's completed. But it then proceeds to move to displays around the world, very widely in the United States. And you can see sort of mothers crying in agony, holding their dead children, pieces of bodies lying around. And like the bombing itself, this image of Guernica has a very powerful impact outside of Spain. Franco, after the war, actually tries to get it back to Spain, but Picasso will have nothing of it. And so it doesn't end up in Spain until after both Picasso and Franco are dead. The Condor Legion, condemned in most of the world, of course, returns to Germany as heroes. They had claimed over 400 kills of enemy aircraft against only 72 lost, and they have established themselves as a highly effective fighting force. So at home, the Condor Legion are heroes. To the rest of the world, they are fascist brutes who have heartlessly killed women and children and the civilian population. All the nastiness is not on the side of the fascists, however. The Red Terror, as it is called, kills in the order of 50,000 people in the Republican-held area of Spain. In July 1936, 861 priests and other religious figures are killed. On the 25th of July, the feast of St. James, the patron saint of Spain, 95 are murdered on that day alone. In total, about 3,400 priests, nuns, and monks are murdered over the period of a couple of years. And even more gruesome, as you can see in the pictures, the bodies of long dead priests and nuns are exhumed and displayed on the steps of cathedrals. Churches are burned. So this doesn't get that much attention outside of Spain. It does in fascist countries. It does within the church. But it doesn't play as well externally as the bombing of Guernica. So in the balance of who is winning the propaganda war, there's not much doubt that the Republicans and the left are winning that battle. Pretty grim stuff on both sides. There are no good guys in the Spanish Civil War. Back to the list of events. The Canadians start arriving in the spring of 1937, and they join the American Abraham Lincoln Battalion. The Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion is not actually formed until midsummer of 1937. And this is done because you start to get enough Canadians in the American battalions, and they lobby to form their own battalion. When it is first formed, however, it is anything but a purely Canadian battalion. Almost half of the battalion are Americans. The first commanding officer is an American. It's more important to be a good, solid communist than it is to be either a Canadian or a soldier when you're looking for somebody to lead the battalion. Fortunately, unlike most of the international brigades, the Mac-Paps have a period of about 3 months where they undergo some good, solid basic training. So when they arrive at the Aragon front in 1937, they're certainly well above the mark for the rest of the international brigade. Nevertheless, their first major action at Fuente de Ebro in the fall of 1937 does not go well. Not because they don't perform well, but the promised artillery support and air support simply doesn't materialize. And so the end of the Ebro battle is seen as a defeat for the Republican Army, and the Mac-Paps come out of it pretty bloodied indeed. Their next major action in late 1937 is part of the defense of Madrid. Teruel is a small town outside Madrid, and the Mac-Paps are part of that defense. And that still manages to keep Franco and his troops at bay. Later on, they are involved in what are called the retreats, and this is really trying to block Franco from cutting the Republican area in half. The Canadians perform very well in the crossing of the Ebro River. But again, they are gradually pushed back. We see the fall of Barcelona in late 1913, and by the spring of 1913, the nationalists enter Madrid unopposed. And by this point, the International Brigades have basically been dissolved and are moving out of Spain. So the road to Spain, how do we get there? Well, we see a lot of involvement of the Communist Party of Canada. Here's the BC district organizing recruits to get to Spain. So you've got a combination of people that are dedicated and enthusiastic communists, people that are just idealistic young men who are concerned about the rise of fascism. I always remember my father putting it this way. He said, if you were a young man in the mid-30s in Canada and you weren't a communist, or at least thinking about it, you didn't have a heart. If you were still a communist 20 years later, when the Soviets were moving in to put down rebellions in Eastern Europe, you didn't have a brain. That was his rather simplistic way of explaining it to me. So here's an image of the Mac-Paps as they arrive in Spain, but they're a very disparate group, and I want to give you a look at some of the individuals. They're, of course, named after William Lyon Mackenzie and Louis-Joseph Papineau, the leaders of the 1837 rebellion. The Americans picked historic American names for their battalions, and so the Canadians felt it appropriate to do likewise and pick two bona fide revolutionaries to name the battalion after. Some notable Canadians. You'll be interested in the Chinese figures on the left, and I will explain that in a minute. But not all Mac-Paps were Canadians, and not all Canadians were Mac-Paps. And the most famous Canadian, perhaps, in the Spanish Civil War was Dr. Norman Bethune. Bethune is best known for introducing mobile blood transfusion units. There were some people that tried this earlier, but his was by far the most successful operation. And he built this blood transfusion service to support the Republican cause in Spain. He was there only for a relatively brief period of time, not quite a year. And again, Bethune was one of these people that was accused of being a Trotskyite. He returned to Canada to promote the Mac-Pap cause, but ultimately ended up heading off to China to support Mao Zedong in the Long March. And this is where his image is really created. The large bust that you see at the bottom is not in Canada, it's in Beijing. And today, if you ever visit China, one of the first questions they'll ask you when they find out you're a Canadian is, do you know about Norman Bethune? And in China today, we have medical colleges and the military medical units and all kinds of things that are named after Norman Bethune. And people who grow up in school start learning English by reading about people like Norman Bethune. He's right up there with Anne of Green Gables being a well-known Canadian. The first commanding officer of the Mac-Paps, Robert Thompson, was an American. Ultimately, after the war, Thompson ends up as the head of the American Communist Party. So he's a dyed-in-the-wool communist organizer, and that's the thing that the International Brigades want to ensure in these early days. He's later replaced by Mackenzie Cecil Smith, the first Canadian to command the Mac-Paps, and he commands them after the bloody Battle of Fuente Debro, but he's wounded later in July 1937. And perhaps interestingly, the battalions all have political commissars attached, and the first commissar attached to the Canadian battalion is Joseph Dallet. Again, he's killed in action in October 1937. Interestingly enough, there are letters from Spain that are available in book form to his wife. After his death, his wife marries a guy named Oppenheimer, who's obviously the guy who's associated with the Manhattan Project. So there are lots of these kind of interesting links in the Spanish Civil War. Even more bizarrely, late in the war, a guy by the name of Gunnar Ebb, who commands the machine gun company of the Mac-Paps for a brief period of time, takes command. He's Finnish, and he's there under an assumed name. His name is really Paavo Kosonen. He survives, is deported to Finland, spends a bit of time in jail there, and you get evidence of that kind of stuff from this type of material that's available, a 1940 telegram describing Gunnar Ebbs and what happened to him after the end of the war. So the bottom line is you have a very disparate group. A lot of the Canadians are fairly recent immigrants. They might have come from Ireland. They might have come from Finland. They might have come from France. And they all come together in this kind of interesting and really quite effective military unit, the Mac-Pap Battalion. By late 1939, though, Franco's forces, with the support of Germany and Italy, become increasingly effective. And they effectively cut off Republican Spain from Barcelona. Barcelona had been pretty critical, a major resupply point for Russian support to Spain, and it's cut off. And by early 1939, things are looking pretty grim, and essentially the Republican forces collapse, and Madrid is taken without a fight. I want to talk now a little bit about what happens after the war and the continuing constant controversy. This is the major monument in Spain to the Spanish Civil War. And to give you an idea of scale, the cross that you see in the middle is 150 meters tall. It is arguably the largest, or certainly one of the largest crosses anywhere in the world. And Franco, after the war, in an attempt to try and bring the country back together to some extent, creates this massive monument. And the people that are buried here are from both sides. Anybody who has fallen in the Spanish Civil War can be interned here in the Valley of the Fallen. When Franco dies, however, his supporters decide that it's only appropriate that he too be buried in the Basilica, the central place here in the Valley of the Fallen. And that immediately raises a controversy. This is supposed to be for people that died in the Spanish Civil War. Clearly, Franco didn't die, and so he shouldn't be interred here. But the church, the Catholic Church, who own the Basilica, say, what business is it of yours, government? We're the church, this is our building, and we can decide who gets buried here and who doesn't get buried here. The debate begins to get more heated as late as 1911, and there's an extensive debate in the Spanish Parliament that goes on from 1911 to 2011 to 2019, when Franco's body is ultimately exhumed and moved out of the Valley of the Fallen. He goes into a much more modest place, but that too becomes a place of pilgrimage for fans of the fascists. The other major event we have on the other side of the coin is the beatification of victims of the Red Terror, martyrs to the cause of Catholicism. And in 2007, 498 victims of the Red Terror are beatified in Vatican Square in Rome. The Spanish ambassador is in attendance, but this is a reflection of the other side of the coin in the Spanish Civil War, the terrible things that were done in the name of the Republic. The Republican argument has always been this was not a matter of government policy. These were radicals that we simply couldn't control. We weren't trying to prosecute the church, but when you're the government, it's a little hard to sustain that argument. In Canada, memorialization doesn't happen very early. When the Mac-Paps come back from Spain, they are welcomed home by large crowds, 10,000 in Toronto. But the crowds are very much the left-wing part of the Canadian populace. And a lot of people who have simply accepted the rather heroic, romantic story of the Mac-Paps. But the government of the day is very, very concerned about giving the communists any credibility. The Communist Party is outlawed, and government support is grudging indeed. Monuments tend to get erected when there are NDP governments in power provincially. And one of the early ones that get erected is this monument in Toronto in 1995. And basically what happens is folks in Spain send a great big rock over to Canada from a battlefield, and Canadians put a plaque on it. So the early memorial should tend to see will be a little brass plaque on the edge of a city hall, or that type of thing going on. In Victoria, we get a little more creative. Again, NDP government, and this is the Victoria Memorial. If you haven't seen it, it's down just across Menzies Street from the legislative buildings. And the plaque on it says 1,000 Canadians volunteered, 600 killed in action. And 1/4 of those volunteers come from British Columbia. Whenever you're reading about the Spanish Civil War, you get wildly varying numbers, and it depends what you mean by a Canadian volunteer. Are we talking just about the Mac-Pap Battalion? Are we talking about just Canadians in the Mac-Pap Battalion? What are we really talking about? How do we define that figure? But the young lady, at least to me, looks much like that photograph we saw earlier from the defense of Madrid. We finally get a national memorial and more formal government recognition. This one is unveiled in 2001, and it's unveiled by the Governor General. The brass plaques on the front of it have the names of over 1,500 members of, quote, the Canadian contingent. But when you actually look at the names, a lot of these people are Americans, a large number of Americans, people from Finland, from Ireland, and from various other places who were associated with the Mac-Pap Battalion. They served in the Mac-Pap Battalion, or they worked alongside the Canadians. So in trying to identify who gets their name, the net was cast pretty wide. And here the number we have is 721 who lost their lives. But when you start to dig into the detail, a lot of these folks ended up in Spain under false names and everything else. So it's very difficult to nail down the details. Canada's oldest Mac-Pap died in just before the monument got unveiled in Victoria. Spain at this point is recognizing, of course, the members of the International Brigade and offering them honorary Spanish citizenship. So William Krem becomes an honorary citizen of Spain before he finally dies. So that's the story of the Mac-Paps, squeezed in like drinking from a fire hose a bit, I suppose, but I tried to cover as much as I could. And I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Scott?
Thanks, Jim, for that. That was excellent. I'm going to pose some general questions to you, and then we'll see if we have any audience questions, and we'll go from there. But
okay,
you mentioned that although the Spanish Civil War ended in late March 1939, the International Brigades were actually ordered withdrawn from Spain in the fall of 1938. And consequently, the last Canadians actually returned to Canada actually by May of 1939. But more pertinently, can you explain why the Spanish Republican government would order the early withdrawal of the international volunteers, especially when the war seemed to be turning against them in the fall of 1938?
Well, I think the Republican government saw the writing on the wall. And from the perspective of communism, the last thing you want to do is end up with a lot of your pro-communist volunteers in the hands of fascists as prisoners of war. A, they wouldn't have been treated very gently, and B, they are a valuable resource to the communist movement internationally, and you want to save them from that inevitable fate. I think that's the reality.
Yeah, I think you're right, because I noticed just looking back what else was happening in 1938. And of course, Chamberlain's Munich Pact with Adolf Hitler was signed in September of 1938. And of course, that gave up the Sudetenland, which basically broke down Czechoslovakia. And of course, the Anschluss with Austria occurred in March of 1938. So yes, certainly any of the German, Austrian, Italian, Czech volunteers in the international brigades would have been very much at risk if the Republicans had lost and they had been captured.
Yeah.
Okay. You talked about communism. You talked a bit about the motivations of the Canadian volunteers. But what is your sense of the overall motivation for the majority of the Canadian volunteers to fight in Spain? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I think that the big underlying factor was you have this huge number of unemployed and unlikely to be employed young men in pretty desperate economic conditions. And this very romantic image that is created with the defense of Madrid and thou shalt not pass, it comes across very strongly. So there's a lot of emotional appeal to this. Obviously, the Communist Party was critical to organizing the event, but this is not a group of intellectuals that would be thoroughly familiar with the writings of Karl Marx. It's not a bunch of university students. These are working people. If you would ask them to actually articulate what the Communist Manifesto is all about, my guess is that you wouldn't have had a particularly academic sort of response. The Communist Party, and before they went over, sort of tested their credentials, but it wouldn't have been rocket science for word to get around. Here's what the questions are going to ask you are. Here's what the answers you should give them are. It's kind of like going into the restaurant in these COVID times and saying, here's your COVID questions, and everybody knows what the questions are, and they've got the nodding the head down pretty well. Clearly, some of them were dedicated, committed communists, no doubt about it at all. But a lot of them were had a light touch of communism, and were more enthusiastic about fascism shall be destroyed, as you see on the banner of the Mac-Paps battalion. It doesn't say communism shall be spread. It's about destroying fascism.
Okay. I think our audience would assume, given this is in the 1930s, that the international volunteers, regardless of nationality, Canadians included, would be all male. Were there any Canadian women volunteers who served in Spain? And if so, how did they contribute?
There were. You have some women reporters, some women involved with the medical organization. You'll recall the image of Norman Bethune had a woman alongside him. So there are some of those. We don't have a lot in the way of stories of those figures. They're not easy to dig out. There was certainly a lot of support from women in Canada to help the Mac-Paps get overseas in the first place, because there was some expense involved. So typically from British Columbia, they would go across the border here. They'd get on a bus that had been rented, and somebody's got to pay for it. They would go off and land in New York, where they'd get on a ship and their passage paid for to get over to Spain. So there's that kind of support as well. Not many women, but certainly some involved.
Okay. What was the attitude of the Canadian government of the day, and also the greater Canadian public toward these Canadian volunteers serving and fighting in Spain? And should the Mac-Paps, because we talked a bit about memorialization, but should the Mac-Paps and the other Canadian volunteers have been publicly recognized and supported by the Canadian government of the day? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the Canadian government of the day was paranoid about communists. They had outlawed communism. I think it's 1927. Thrown people like Tim Buck in jail. This was not a view that was widely supported by people in general in Canada. As I mentioned with my father's comment, communism was seen as a rather sort of romantic thing. The kind of words that get bandied around, as an example, from each according to his means, or from each according to his ability, to each according to his means. I'm quite sure Tommy Douglas could show you where that is a biblical reference, but the reality is it's from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. So those kind of words were seen as pretty popular in the day. But from the government perspective, the threat of labor unrest, particularly in a time when the economy is not going well, is pretty threatening. And so they are not keen to give the Mac-Paps any recognition at all. The newspaper gives them reasonable coverage. When they come home, the newspaper coverage is quite good, but there's a tendency to discount the influence of the Communist Party in a lot of that coverage. Again, we're fighting fascists. It's not we're supporting communism or we're rallying to the communist cause. That sort of stuff is quite downplayed. And even people like Tim Buck, I think he is quite successful in sort of playing both sides against the middle. He convinces the Stalinist communists in the Soviet Union that he's a good, solid, dependable guy. But in Canada, the party, in fact, reaches out to a much broader spectrum of people than probably Joe Stalin would approve of.
Did I take it the Mac-Paps and the Canadian Volunteers didn't receive any government support in the form of medical assistance or veterans pensions or anything like that, did they?
No, they didn't. And many of them in 1939 tried to volunteer for the Canadian Armed Forces. Some of them were accepted, but often when people found out who they were and what their background was, they would be shuffled off to some area where they couldn't cause any trouble. You didn't, when you were going in to volunteer, you didn't advertise the fact that you were a Mac-Pap volunteer, and that wouldn't have got you any points in the recruiting office at all. And a lot of them, when it became known that they were Mac-Pap veterans, were simply refused entry.
Okay, thank you for that. You touched on before the Second World War, the Canadian government's impression and perception of communism. Of course, with the involvement of the British in the Russian Civil War, it was very much seen as a major global threat to peace and democracy. But certainly after the defeat of the Spanish Republic in 1939, in March 1939, fascism was probably increasingly seen as the main threat to peace and democracy. And of course, it was only a few months after that that the Germans invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939 and the Second World War started. So at that point, communism becomes a friend, if you will, through an alliance with the Soviet Union. But of course, that changes again in the late 1940s. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, communism again becomes the major threat. So even during the war, where the Mac-Paps and the Canadian Volunteers seem to get a bit of redemption as being on the right side in the Spanish conflict, it doesn't last very long. But one recent book writing about the Canadians' participation in the Spanish Civil War was entitled The Gallant Cause. In your opinion, was it a gallant cause to fight for Spain in the late 1930s?
I think opposition to fascism is almost by definition a gallant cause, but it's a mistake to see the Republican side as somehow pure and unblemished. The types of things that happened in areas under Republican control are shocking, are horrible. The persecution of the church and people associated with them, taking nuns out and priests out and lining them up and murdering them. And the argument that it's not our fault, we really couldn't control these people, they just got out of hand, really doesn't, I think, get you off the hook. I think the people in the International Brigades genuinely thought they were doing a good and noble thing by opposing the fascists. But there's enough blood and blame to go around on both sides of this conflict. There really are the number of good guys around are kind of limited to the the boundaries of, I think the guys in the Mac-Pap Battalion could argue they were good guys. The people in Norman Bethune's medical unit could argue that they're good guys. But as soon as you get outside that sort of hardcore, there's some pretty nasty stuff going on in Spain.
Okay, thanks for that. But so I guess that kind of leads into the next obvious question is what is the legacy of the Mac-Paps today? How would we sum that up? I mean, you've sort of touched on it, but how would we sum that up now?
Well, I think the image of the Mac-Paps as idealistic young men who went off to fight against a force that was seen as nasty and evil is quite valid. They did believe they were doing the right thing. In many ways, they were doing the right thing. This is the first resistance to fascism, to point out that this is these are a bad bunch of guys. And I think it's entirely appropriate that we do have memorials to recognize these Canadians who went off to volunteer and die for fighting for what was seen as a good cause. But when you sit back in retrospect and say, was Franco bad for Spain? You know, Spain was neutral in World War II. He kept them out of the war. Under Franco, the economy recovered from a disastrous state. He made efforts to try and bring the sides together, the memorial, the Valley of the Fallen type of thing. He still did some pretty nasty things, but I wouldn't put Franco in the same category as Adolf Hitler. I wouldn't put Franco in the same category as Benito Mussolini. Was he a good guy? No, he wasn't a good guy, but sort of if you want to rank people in order of evilness, Franco, I don't think comes up there as anything close to the most evil fascist around.
Okay, appreciate that. I think that's a pretty good summation of their legacy today. So do you have any other final thoughts on the Mac-Paps and the Canadian volunteers in Spain before we move on to questions from the audience?
No, I don't think so. I'm open to questions.
Okay, let's see what we've got here. From John, what was the impetus for your students to choose the Spanish Civil War as a topic? And what does that say about the awareness of the war in contemporary Canada?
I think it was the statue as much as anything else. I think one of them was sort of wandering around town. One of the students had been involved with doing historic tours in downtown Victoria. And there's a group in Victoria you may be familiar with that dresses up in costume, military costumes, and he's been part of that group. And so he was familiar with a lot of things in Victoria, and I think convinced his classmates that this would just be cool and interesting and a little bit different, something to try out. And I think they were right. I think it is a fascinating subject. I think they learned a lot. The object of the exercise was to get them to use archival material, to go out and explore original sources and to read very critically stuff that had been written. And this is a great example of that era. You've got to understand where the author is coming from before you can make sense of what they're reading. The story you get from somebody from the left is going to be very different than the story you get from somebody who's writing the history of the Condor Legion or something like that.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. That's where I come from. I mean, I'm interested in the Canadian participation in this unusual war, which was, of course, a prelude to the Second World War. And of course, as you just mentioned, the Condor Legion. Obviously, it ended up being a testing ground for tactics, doctrine, and weapons technology. Obviously, the Germans are able to fight more effectively with their combined arms tactics, blitzkrieg, etc., than if they hadn't gone to Spain. So there's kind of a double end to that. There's the political end, the Canadian participation, and then technology in preparation for the Second World War. And I would sort of submit you can't really talk about the Second World War without at least having an awareness and understanding of what happened in Spain, both politically and militarily. The next question we've got is, could you elaborate on the difficulties for the volunteers to get across the Atlantic? And didn't Canada prohibit them from going, as did the USA, try to intercept them?
Yeah, yes, indeed. Canada passed legislation that made it illegal to go and do what these guys were doing. The Canadians tended to go. Many of them went through the United States, as I mentioned in response to an earlier question, particularly the folks from BC. Crossed the border here in British Columbia, and then took a bus across the country and left from New York. Most of the volunteers ended up going through France, and although France signed on to the arms embargo and the neutrality issue, France was a pretty left-leaning country at this time, and indeed they sent a great number of volunteers themselves. In fact, more than Canada did. So the Pyrenees tended to be a rather leaky border, and so you have examples of Mac-Paps who were intercepted on the way and kept in prison for a while, but not for a particularly long period of time. And strangely enough, they would be released from prison and suddenly find their way hitchhiking or however to get through the Pyrenees to France. So that was the principal way. Some were able to go more directly through Barcelona or places like that, but most of them ended up going through France.
Given the context that you mentioned of the Canadian military refusing many or most being able to serve during the Second World War, even though they had some battlefield experience, were there any Mac-Pap survivors who achieved notable service in the Canadian forces during the Second World War?
Not that I'm aware of. There were certainly people that served, but notable service in terms of did they command a battalion of Canadians or anything like that? Not that I'm aware of. The most notable exception being not in Canada, but in China and Norman Bethune.
Okay. Another question listed as anonymous. It's maybe not a question, but did you know the Manitoba legislature passed a resolution to urge the Canadian government to recognize the Mac-Paps in 1983? Were you aware of that?
I was not aware of that. It doesn't particularly surprise me. There have been movements like that over time. The question is, what does that mean? If I recognize the Mac-Paps? To me, having the Governor General of Canada unveil a national memorial in Ottawa is recognizing the Mac-Paps as being historically significant to Canada. It doesn't mean the government of Canada has any obligation to families of veterans or descendants of veterans or anything like that. But it does mean that we will no longer suppress the history of the Mac-Paps. So if you go on government websites now about the history of the period, you'll find a good deal of material about the Mac-Paps. It's no longer sort of banished from public view by government edict. And I think that's really as far as we can expect the government of Canada to go.
Yeah, something people wouldn't realize unless they lived in Ottawa, as I did. The Mac-Paps Memorial which is on Green Island near the Rideau Falls, where the Governor General, who only would have had to walk across the street virtually to unveil it, it is not in an isolated corner of a wood or a park somewhere. It's actually in a very prominent location, surrounded by other Canadian war memorials. There's a war memorial to the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan there, listing all the names of the trainees and the flyers who died while trying to train on aircraft in Canada before going overseas. There's also the Royal Canadian Artillery memorial is there. So it's not shunted off in a corner. And I think you're quite right. Being unveiled to the Governor General is about as good as it gets.
And I think particularly as the Governor General at the time was Adrian Clarkson, probably the most media aware Governor General we've ever had. And by coincidence, she's also currently the Colonel in Chief of my regiment, the Princess Patricias.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question from Paul, and you may or may not be aware of this, but he asked, what is Dr. Kempling's view of the current Trent University program focused on a new interpretation of history as reflected by the studies of Dr. Cazorla Sanchez on the Mac-Paps? And this is a cooperative program between Trent University and the Mackenzie-Papineau Memorial Fund. Again, you may not be aware of it.
I confess I am not aware of the program, so I really can't pass comment on it. I'll certainly look it up.
But there's certainly been, there's Mark Zolke's book on the Mac-Paps. This is a few years old now, but a few years ago, there was another book written called The Renegades by Michel Petrou.
Yes.
On the Canadian volunteers, which is quite useful. It's also spun a website as well. He actually lists the 1,500 giving allowance for nom de guerres.
Yes.
Lists the 1,500 and some odd volunteers, Canadian volunteers who served in Spain, where they were born, whether they were Canadian citizens or not, and also their ultimate fate, whether they were wounded, killed, or their status was unknown. Yes. So that's quite a good one. And there's also a new biography on the, the Canadian battalion commander as well, just came out a little while ago.
Yes.
Let's see, I'm just looking at some other questions here. Let's see, just waiting for the thing to come up here. Looks like it wants to buffer a bit. Not sure why it's doing that, but hopefully we can get it to come back up. Okay, it looks like we had a bit of a technical issue there. We've resolved that. We've answered everybody's questions. So that's the conclusion of today's webinar on Canadians in the Spanish Civil War, specifically the Mac-Paps, as given by Dr. Jim Kempling. So thank you, Dr. Kempling, for an excellent and interesting presentation on the lesser known subject of Canadian participation in the Spanish Civil War, and specifically the Mac-Paps. Also for your time and effort in putting this together for our members. So on behalf of the members of RUSI-VI, Jim, thank you very much.